We're back. I'm joined in the studio today by Gary Bartleson, air traffic control instructor, Joe Vosick, aviation lawyer and professor of aviation law here at UND and former airline pilot, and Dr. Warren Jensen, who is a professor of human factors and a flight surgeon. Before we start today, let's take a look at the runway incursion scenario one more time.
Academy Tower, Academy Air 244, taxiing Bravo for runway 28 right. We'll be ready for takeoff.
Academy Air 244, Academy Tower, runway 28 right.
Turn right heading 310, clear for takeoff.
Cleared for takeoff, 28 right, heading 310, Academy Air 244.
Academy Tower, Cessna 666 Golf Bravo, off runway 28 left on Delta, looking for parking.
Cessna 666 Golf Bravo, Academy Tower, hold short of runway 28 right.
Run. Academy Tower, Gulfstream 146 Mike Papa, inbound, visual runway 28 left.
Gulfstream 146 Mike Papa, Academy Tower, runway 28 left, cleared to land. Traffic will be a CRJ departing runway 28 right.
Cleared to land, runway 28 left, Gulfstream 6 Mike Papa.
Before takeoff check complete.
Set thrust.
Thrust set. $80 knots.
Checks.
Aircraft on the runway. Abort.
Reject. Max brakes.
All right, so certainly a very scary situation. So Joe, as somebody who has flown professionally, what are your options in that kind of situation?
They're limited. Just like the scenario showed, about the only thing you can do when the timing is that tight is to just apply max brakes and hope you don't hit the other person.
And Dr. Jensen, is it just a breakdown of communication in this situation, do you think?
Yeah, there clearly was a breakdown in which information was given, but it really wasn't received very well. And so a lot of breakdowns in communication are difficult to detect, like this one.
Okay. And when you're flying, isn't proper radio protocol really is to listen on the frequency for a few seconds, but the Gulfstream pilot doesn't seem to do that here. How do you guys think that impacted the situation?
On the controller side, you get the young man that's working the tower is busy not only working with the flight progress strips, but issuing a hold short instruction to an aircraft, anticipating that readback, which wasn't given, turning around, having a Gulfstream call up for a short final full stop, and also issuing a clearance for the RJ. And that's where everything just came together. They all contributed to what happened. Frequency congestion.
Okay, what do you think is the weakest link then in the situation here?
Readback hold instructions. That's what's required of the controller. The controller anticipated that call was already made, didn't catch it, and you saw what happened on the video clip.
Well, let's take a look at what would have happened in the situation if the controller had gotten the readback of the hold short instructions.
Gulfstream 146 Mike Papa, Academy Tower, standby.
Break, Cessna 6 Golf Bravo, readback, hold short instructions.
Sorry about that, Tower. Hold short runway 28 right, Cessna 6 Golf Bravo.
Gulfstream 4 Mike Papa, runway 28 left, cleared to land.
Traffic will be a CRJ departing runway 28 right.
Cleared to land, runway 28 left, Gulfstream 6 Mike Papa.
All right, now is it worth pointing out that, maybe you can answer this one, Gary, when a controller is talking to a lot of different aircraft and giving a lot of different instructions, when a new aircraft checks on, the controller doesn't necessarily have to deal with that aircraft right away if there are more pressing things to do. Is that right?
That's correct. There is a certain procedure you follow. IFR clearances first, and then anything that happens after the VFR. And to me, it looked like the Gulfstream was probably a VFR arrival, runway 28 left, where the IFR traffic is more of the priority in this case.
Dr. Jensen, we have in this situation a controller who goes from not being very busy at all, really, to having 3 aircraft talk to him within about a 30-second period. What are some of the human factors elements involved in the situation?
Well, 2 things right off the bat. One is task saturation, where suddenly they get a high workload, many different instructions, different aircraft, and a lot of things to keep track of. The other is distraction. where you're now waiting to hear the hold short instructions back. At the same time, you get another aircraft calling in, and you suddenly are diverted to that when you miss the primary task that you're doing. Very easy to occur.
Now, Joe, as someone who trains young pilots, it's easy for us to look at the situation and say, well, the pilot of the Cessna just either ignored the instruction or just blew right over the hold short line. But what kinds of things are going on in the cockpit that maybe controllers should be aware of when they're listening?
Right when an aircraft exits a runway, typically pilots are a little bit busy cleaning up. They'll be retracting their flaps and turning off lights and transponders, switching radio frequencies, maybe looking at the airport diagram. Now granted, they shouldn't do those things until the airplane is past the hold short line and stopped. And in this case, perhaps the pilot was busy doing something of that nature, and even read back or heard the hold short instruction, read it back in his or her mind, and just never did it.
That brings up an interesting point too, and any of you can jump in on this one, but in the latest runway safety report issued by the FAA, they said that a lot of runway incursions happen because pilots hear a hold short instruction, read back the hold short instruction, and still taxi onto the runway. What do you think? What do you think are some of the reasons that something like that happens?
Well, I'll start us off. They range from the individual pilot's perceptual errors, maybe just not seeing a hold short line or being unfamiliar with the airport, to a systemic problem we may have, like the hold short signals just aren't enough, especially if you're in an unfamiliar place at night, for example, and it's just a sea of lights. You just might not be able to discern where it is, and if you're busy doing other things at the same time, the deck gets stacked against you.
Okay. So, Dr. Jensen, this phenomenon of hearing something, even reading something back, and still not doing it, from a human factors perspective, what are the elements playing into that?
Yeah, we call those procedural errors, and it's because we actually know we're trying to do something, but we're actually doing something else. We intend to do the right thing, but we actually don't realize that we've now erred and we've crossed into the runway or we've done something else. There are a lot of factors that contribute to that, but I would say workload is one of them, where suddenly you get distracted and you're going on to the next task. Sometimes we have so much training and so much background, we kind of automatically do what we've always done, and we forget that we've been given instructions to do something else. It's a common occurrence when you jump in your car and you're not focused on driving and you drive by the turn that you intended to make because you're back in the habit of doing what you've done before. So there's a lot of different reasons.
And Gary, you kind of alluded to this before, but if you have a situation where a pilot can hear an instruction and read it back and still not do it, what are the controller's options then for making sure that a situation doesn't develop into an emergency like this?
Well, first of all, just hearing the read back fulfills one of the squares. But the second portion is scanning that runway again. You've got an aircraft that's in a critical phase of takeoff, and the one landing runway 28 left has no bearing on what's going on. But the one that's departing runway 28 right with the one holding 3/4 of the way, or 1/4 of the way down the runway, there's a potential problem that will exist. So keep scanning. That's imperative that you do that.
Let's take a look at what would have happened in the situation if the controller had been scanning the runways and managed to prevent the situation from developing into the emergency that it becomes.
Forward takeoff check complete.
Set thrust.
Thrust set.
Academy Air 244, cancel takeoff clearance, brake, Cessna 6 Golf Bravo, exit the runway immediately. You're supposed to hold short.
Roger, we're clearing the runway, Cessna 6 Golf Bravo.
Okay, so in this situation, the controller saw what was happening and was able to stop the aircraft before it had accelerated too much and gotten in a position where it probably wouldn't be able to stop. So, Joe, maybe you can answer this as someone who's flown professionally again. When you're taxiing on the ground, when you're on the runway in takeoff position, how much are you relying on the controllers to be looking around you and keeping you advised of other traffic and things that are happening?
Well, in a professional flight crew, you have two pilots in there, like we saw on the scenario. So that's 2 sets of eyes, and the controller is your 3rd set, essentially. So the more the better. You notice from the scenario that the captain didn't really look down. He was looking out the window and pushed the thrust levers up and said set thrust. He doesn't look down to bother to see, because you have to adjust them before you take off to various thrust ratios. That's the first officer's job, to have head down in the cockpit. So there you've only got 1 set of eyes outside, but that additional set from the control tower can really save the day, especially if now the captain's looking far down the runway and maybe just doesn't have his or her scan in the right place at the right times.
And Gary, does a situation like this really just come down to the controller looking out the window, and especially when issuing a takeoff clearance or a landing clearance?
Yeah, and I'll reiterate what Joe just said. You've got 2 sets of eyes in the cockpit. The control tower, per regulations, you've got 2 sets in the tower as well. You've got a ground controller that is required to assist the local controller in scanning that runway. If you look back at the first clip, the controller was predominantly looking at the flight progress strips, writing information on there, and not looking out the window. The previous clip showed the controller head up and looking out the window at the same time, and then going back and writing down afterwards, after you're assured that everything is okay.
You know, even though it's the controller's responsibility to see this kind of situation and prevent it from happening by either getting the readback of the hold short instructions, scanning the runways, is there a responsibility on the part of the pilot if he or she thinks something isn't safe or has a question about a certain procedure? Is there a responsibility on the part of the pilot too?
Absolutely. There's a responsibility that pilots must operate their aircraft in a safe manner, essentially. And this is in the federal aviation regulations, so all pilots know about it. Additionally, too, if, let's say, that scenario had resulted in an aircraft contact and some damage or injury, legally speaking, pilots have the duty to avoid accidents like that, and controllers have a concurrent duty to do it too. So I wouldn't say that it's just on one or the other. It's a shared mutual responsibility. The way we say it in law is joint and several, meaning you have all of it at the same time you share it.
Let's see what would have happened in the situation if the pilots aboard the CRJ had questioned the controller and decided not to take off.
Forward takeoff check complete.
Set thrust. Hey, is that guy gonna stop? Hold it. Let's just wait. Tell
Okay.
tower.
Academy Tower, we're holding a position for that Cessna.
Academy Air 244, roger, brake, Cessna 6 Golf Bravo, exit the runway immediately, you're supposed to hold short.
Roger, we're clearing the runway, Cessna 6 Golf Bravo.
Okay, so here the pilots aboard the CRJ decided not to take off, even though they'd been cleared to do so. I mean, Gary, can a pilot just do that? Can they just decide to disregard a controller's instruction like that?
Yes, as a matter of fact, if you listen to the first clip, the aircraft that landed and was told to hold short it never acknowledged the hold short instructions. So in this case, the pilot possibly that was taking off heard that and said, hey, shouldn't we be getting a whole read back instruction here? And if not, query the controller. That's the best way to avoid any type of situation.
You know, is it something pilots should be aware of too when they're operating, is to be listening not just to radio calls directed at them, but to listen to everything to get a better picture of what's going on?
Yes, absolutely. And sometimes student pilots make the mistake that, well, I only have to acknowledge what comes from me, and if air traffic control tells me to do something, I must follow it. To some extent, sure, but being a full-fledged commercial pilot and being in charge of multi-million-dollar pieces of equipment and lives in the back means you've got to be aware of all other traffic in the area. And yes, you do have the final decision as pilot to make that call whether to go or not. And in this particular scenario, clearly the pilots made the right decision.
Okay, and Dr. Jensen, like we kind of talked about earlier, the controller in this situation goes from having not a whole lot to do to all of a sudden having 3 aircraft calling up wanting 3 different things at once. How does somebody work to prioritize things when they're having a lot of information thrown at them at once?
Again, a lot of it comes down to training. One of the good examples from these scenarios is where the Gulfstream called in, the air traffic controller said stand by, and then went back to the Cessna to make sure that he got the holdback instructions before he went on to the next step. So being able to have that maturity and decision-making skill where you can identify where your greatest threats are and deal with those directly is the best strategy. So identify, prioritize, and then delegate the duties that need to be done is the training that we see.
Any other comments on the situation? I mean, do you think a situation like what we saw is common? Is it something that can happen to anybody at any time, anywhere.
Oh yeah, yes indeed. One of the reports that just came out by the FAA was in the last 4 months, starting in this fiscal year that started 1 October, there's already 233 runway incursions that happened in the United States. So that is a problem, and it needs to be addressed, and they're doing a lot of things with that. But everybody has something to pitch, put it that way. Runway stoplights, sensors, and things like that. But it still boils down to the human factor of it.
Dr. Jensen, comment on the human factor.
Yeah, situation awareness is very fragile and very perishable. You can have it for a moment, and then in the next moment it'll be gone. And the other thing is it takes a lot of work to be situationally aware. And that's where controllers and pilots really have a big demand on their jobs, is maintaining that situation awareness.
Any final thoughts, Joe?
Statistically speaking, we have an awful lot of air traffic, and it's all going to the same place, all the airports. And when you have that kind of odds, where everyone wants to go to the same place, you're going to have some sort of conflict unless everyone's at the top of the game, and whether that's situation awareness or gadgetry or whatever to try to stop accidents from happening. We need all we can get. Or we need to build more pavement or have less airplanes. I don't know what the solution is, but for now I think the best thing we can do is train pilots to be situationally aware and realize that working with the controllers is the best ingredients for safety.
All right. Well, Gary Bartleson, Joe Vosick, Dr. Jensen, thanks so much for joining me today. When we come back, we're going to review some of the stuff we went over today, and we'll take a look at some of the resources available from the FAA about runway safety.
In the runway incursion scenario, what was the first mistake in the chain of events? A, the controller did not ensure a readback of the hold short instructions. B, the controller did not use proper phraseology when issuing the landing clearance. C, the pilot of the Cessna did not read back hold short instructions. Or D, Academy air pilots did not properly configure the aircraft's landing lights. The correct answer is A. The controller is responsible for confirming readback of all hold short instructions. If the pilot does not read back hold short instructions, the controller must prompt the pilot to read them back. True or false, ground control shall assist local control in visually scanning the runways. The correct answer is true. According to the 7110.65, ground control shall assist local control in visually scanning runways, especially when runways are in close proximity to other movement areas.